so we calculated last class, we calculated the spending multiplier, and we know that the formula for the spending multiplier is, you can write it either as a function of MPC or as a function of MPS. Because if you have the MPC, you know the MPS. If you know the MPS, you know the MPC, right? They got to add up to 1. So the MPC is 0.7, MPS is 0.3, MPC is 0.8, MPS is 0.2. So the formula is going to be either 1 divided by 1 minus MPC, or another formula for it is 1 divided by MPS, because it's the same thing. And on a test, you may have a question such as, if the MPC goes up, what happens to the multiplier? Well, all you got to do is give yourself a couple of numbers for MPC, and you say, well, if MPC is 0.5, the multiplier is 2. And if the MPC goes up from 0.5 to 0.8, then the multiplier is 5. So from 0.5 to 0.8, it goes from 2 to 5. So if the MPC goes up, the multiplier goes up, and vice versa. Okay. Obviously, for the MPS is the opposite. If the MPS goes up, then the multiplier goes down, and vice versa. Okay. Now, the question that we had last class was, well, how come in real life the real multiplier, because there is a multiplying effect. In other words, when the government increases its spending, the economy grows by more the initial increase in government spending. So there's some increase in government spending, and then that translates into an increase in the GDP that is greater than this initial increase in government spending. So that means that we do have a multiplying effect. However, the value is not close to the value that we have in theory, because we know that we can calculate, actually with empirical evidence, we can calculate the spending multipliers. We know what the MPC is in the economy as an average. Obviously, you're going to have one MPC, I'm going to have a different MPC, so another person going to have a different MPC. It all depends. If I give you another $100 worth of income, you're going to spend a certain amount, I'm going to spend a different amount, and so on. But we can do an average, and that would be the average for the country. And then you would expect that, well, if we have the average from the country, we can actually calculate the spending multiplier. And we would get a big number here for the spending multiplier. And that would imply that fiscal policy would be, well, fiscal policy is what the government does. In this case, stimulates the economy by increasing the spending. And that policy would be very powerful, because a small change in G, a small increase in government spending would translate, at least in theory, into a huge increase in the GDP. In other words, it would impact the economy a great deal. So if the government would just do a little bit more, bam, the economy would explode, and we would recover immediately. But that doesn't happen in real life. So what is working against it? What is slowing down this multiplying effect? Okay, so here I'm going to be talking about why the actual multiplier is less than the theoretical multiplier. And well, there are many reasons, but I'm going to just talk about the ones that the book mentions. Okay, so I'm going to try to explain the ones in the books, but there are other reasons too. Those are not the only ones. And I mentioned probably last class that when we talked about the multiplying effect, it it was in many stages. There's one increase which causes another increase, which causes another increase, and so on. And I said last class, well, you cannot allow that rolling system to go on forever. You got to stop and measure it at some point. So that means that you are truncating that whole system at a certain point and say, well, okay, let's see, let's measure now. How much did the GDP grow? You don't allow it to keep on going and going and going. So that's one of the reasons why we have this actual multiplier less, because we're not allowing the process to keep going and going. Okay. Now, another reason is that the book mentions is the crowding out effect. So I'm going to mention the crowding out effect. And the crowding out effect goes something like this. And actually the name itself kind of says the whole thing. It crowds out. Something is being crowded out. Something is being pushed out, if you will, crowded out. Well, what's the crowding out effect? Well, how do we start by? Remember, the whole idea was that government spending has to go up. Remember, the economy for one reason or another slips into a recession. So we're going into a recession. And let me ask you this. When we are in a recession, is spending high or low? Our spending, government spending, business spending, is that spending high or low when we're going into a recession?
Low.
Low, right. Spending is low, and guess what? Production. Is production high or low?
Also low.
Also low. And guess what? We have an equilibrium. Both of them are low because full employment is here. We have an equilibrium. Quantity supplied is low. Quantity demanded is low. It's an equilibrium. So then what's the idea here is somebody's got to do something. Somebody's got to start spending money to put people to work. And that somebody is going to be the government. So now the government wants to increase the spending because we're not spending enough. Businesses are not spending enough. Foreigners are not spending enough. And the government cannot force us to spend more. The government cannot force businesses to spend more. And the government cannot force foreigners to spend more. So who's going to stimulate the economy? Well, the government comes in and they start spending more. Okay, so government spending goes up. The idea is to stimulate aggregate demand, the demand for goods and services. And if nobody demands enough goods and services, then the government is going to step in and demand those goods and services. All right, good. But where is the government going to get this money? Well, let's see. Where are they going to get the money? Well, they can get the money by raising taxes. But there's a problem there. Do you see a problem there? If they raise taxes on us, so the government wants to stimulate the economy by spending more. And the way they come up with this extra money for spending is by taking that money away from
the consumer.
Would that be a smart idea?
No.
No, because you would have at the same time increasing government spending and at the same time decreasing consumption. So you have G going up and C going down. So that would negate the shift in aggregate demand, because remember, aggregate demand comes from our consumption, business consumption, government consumption, and foreign consumption. Well, if G goes up, but C goes down, then you're not stimulating aggregate demand. So this government consumption has to go up, but without taking the money away from somebody else. So what the government does is the government borrows the money. Okay, So they borrow money. There's a problem with that too, but and I'll mention it later. Okay, the government borrows money. The idea here is, if the government borrows money, how do they borrow money? They issue bonds, right? So they issue IOUs. A bond is an IOU. So they issue those bonds. But in order to be able to sell those bonds, to convince people and businesses and whoever, investors, to part away with those bonds, to part away with their money, because what the government wants is money from people, from investors, and they give them IOUs, IOU. And to make this deal sweeter, what do you think that the government is going to have to do with those bonds that they issue? Because those bonds are paying something called interest, exactly. So what do you think they're going to have to do to this interest in order to convince people, convince investors to part with the money and give the government this money?
Raise interest rates.
Exactly. Offer a sweeter deal, because everybody prefers 6% to 5%, 8% to 6%. You know, as an investor, you want to earn as much as you can. So now what the government is going to have to do, so they borrow money. And when they borrow money, they issue bonds. And interest is going to go up. They're going to have higher rates of interest. But guess what? What if businesses would also like to expand at that time? They have to also borrow money. But if government is offering higher rates of interest, then if businesses want to borrow money, they're going to have to offer higher rates of interest themselves, right? So that means that the cost of borrowing money is going to go down, up. I'm sorry. So the cost of borrowing money for everybody else is going to go up, because government bonds are making it sweeter. Well, then you got to make it sweeter too. So it's going to cost you more, because you're going to have to pay higher rates of interest. So what's going to happen is businesses will invest less, because it's more costly to borrow money. So investment is going to go down. Some of consumer consumption, if we need to borrow money to buy a car, if we need to borrow money to buy a washer and dryer or whatever, or that's going to go down too. So some of the consumption is going to go down. So when government borrows money, some of this private consumption is going to go down. So that's where the word crowding out effect comes from. In other words, government spending crowds out private spending. So yes, government spending goes up, and that stimulates the economy in a positive way, no doubt about it. But at the same time, if you have some private spending going down, some whether it comes from us as consumers or from businesses, that drop in the private spending, that is going to stimulate the aggregate demand in a negative direction. It pulls it to the left. So you have 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. Now, that's not exactly, well, that may or may not be true. In other words, folks, it's like this. If businesses have no plans on borrowing money, and given that it's a recession, chances are that they are not looking at expanding or anything like that, then you don't have this crowding out effect, because that money would not be invested in something else. So crowding out effect says this: the government takes it, but that money could have been invested in something else, and therefore you have plus here, government takes the money and spends it, but minus here, private sector doesn't have that money to spend it. But what if the private sector would not spend that money? Then we no longer have that crowding out effect, okay? And then this increase in government spending would really have a big impact, because that money would just be sitting there, would not be doing anything, okay? So if you're taking money that is not doing any good, in other words, it's not being spent and is just sitting there, and somebody takes it and spends it, then it's a great thing. That is going to have a big impact. But if you take money that would be invested by somebody else, then you're going to be, offsetting each other, the effects. Very good. So here we're saying that, well, some of this money that is being bottled by the government could have been invested elsewhere by the private sector, and therefore we have an offsetting effect. And this is one of the reasons why the real multiplier is actually less than the theoretical multiplier. We have another one that the book mentions. And the other reason why the real multiplier is less than the theoretical multiplier is called the open economy effect. So the open economy effect. Obviously, you already know from before that when I say open economy, that means it's got to be having to do with trade, Closed economy, no trade. Open economy, it's open up for trade. Well, how does this one go? Well, it kind of goes the same as crowding out effect up to a point. So it goes like this. The economy is in a recession, government wants to stimulate it, so they increase the spending. So G goes up. I'm going to skip a few steps, and you know already what's going to happen to the interest rates, folks. When government spending goes up, interest rates will go
up.
Yeah, up, exactly. So now, see, government bonds are paying higher rates of interest. Now, the investors, they like higher rates of interest, okay? But guess what? It's not just US investors who like those higher rates of interest, but foreign investors also like those higher rates of interest. Remember that we are operating under the principles of ceteris paribus here. Ceteris paribus means everything else stays constant. So while interest rates are going up in the United States, what happens to interest rates in the rest of the world? They're staying
the same.
Exactly. They're staying the same. The only place where interest rates are going up is here in the United States. So of course now the people who are invested in German bonds or in in EU bonds, I should say, not German. The people who are invested in Chinese bonds, in Japanese bonds, in whatever bonds, they're getting the same as before. Their interest rates in those bonds are not going up, but interest rates in US bonds are going up. So the US bonds become more attractive to all those investors. So they want to invest here, but the only way they can buy those US bonds is if they have dollars. They need dollars for that. So they're going to sell their currencies in order to buy dollars. So when something, everybody is buying dollars, what is happening to the value of the dollar vis-a-vis foreign currencies?
Would the value go down if more people want it?
If think of milk, if everybody wants to buy milk, what's going to happen to the price of milk?
Then it goes up.
Exactly. If everybody wants to buy dollars, guess what? The value of the dollar is going to go up. And as the value of the dollar goes up, what happens to the value of foreign currencies vis-a-vis the dollar?
Goes down.
Goes down, exactly. It's like, because they're moving relative to each other. So one goes up is the same as the other one goes down. It's like saying, well, if the dollar appreciates 10% vis-a-vis the euro, it's like the euro depreciated 10% vis-a-vis the dollar. Okay, so because they're relative to each other. Okay, so the dollar goes up in value. The dollar is strong. Well, is that good or bad? Well, as far as the GDP is concerned, let's think about it. Where does the GDP come from? The aggregate demand comes from our consumption, business consumption, government consumption, and foreign consumption. Well, let's see. Let's think about foreigners. The dollar went up in value, which meant that their currency went down in value. So now our goods to them are more expensive or less expensive? Let's think about it. When their currency goes down in value with respect to the dollar.
Then our exports are more expensive for them.
Exactly. Our goods become more expensive to them. It takes more and more and more of their currency to buy the same amount of dollars with which they can buy a computer or whatever, right? So you think that, whoa, a strong dollar is a great thing. But actually, a strong dollar will depress our exports. It's going to make our goods very expensive to them, and they're going to buy fewer of our goods, which means that there's going to be, when there's this increase in government spending, stimulates the economy in a positive way, there's going to be a decrease in exports, which stimulates the economy in a negative way. Remember, the demand for goods and services goes up because the government spends more money, but the demand for goods and services goes down because foreigners buy fewer of our goods because they're more expensive to them. So you have this crowding, this open economy effect, which says, well, you have a positive impact on the aggregate demand from the increase in government spending, but you also have a negative impact on aggregate demand because foreigners are buying fewer of our goods. So I'm going to say here that the dollar appreciates and exports are going down. Okay. When we talk about economics, that it's pro-government intervention, and economic view that are anti-government intervention, we're going to get more into, well, how can somebody say, I don't want government intervention? Well, why don't you want government intervention? And they have their reasons, and their reasons work under certain assumptions. Whether those assumptions are correct or not, or they take place or not, that's a different story. You know, sometimes they may take place, sometimes they, you know, that's why, you know, a policy that worked yesterday may not work today, and something that works today may not work tomorrow. And you say, well, how come? Wasn't it a good policy yesterday? It worked, you know. Well, yeah, but things have changed. Different circumstances, different assumptions, different things are happening. So that's why economics is more art than science, because you cannot accommodate for all the changes. There's an infinite number of changes that are taking place every day. You know, as simple of how people feel about something. If they're positive about a policy, it may work. If they're negative about policy, it may not work. And that changes from day to day, you know, so. All right, let me mention one more thing and we're just about done. I just want to mention something called automatic stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers are things that make the economy fluctuate less than it would otherwise do. So automatic stabilizers stabilize the economy. The economy, we all know, goes up and down. There are good times and bad times and good times and bad times, and that keeps on repeating. We have the business cycle, the so-called business cycle. So here you have an economy. Times are good, times are tough, times are good, times are tough. Well, those automatic stabilizers, they stabilize the economy, and they make the economy, they make the good times not quite as good and the bad times not quite as bad. So they kind of stabilize the economy. Okay, rather than riding those big waves, we're riding some smaller waves. And we like that. We don't want to have, really good times and then we're unemployed, and really good times and then we're unemployed again. We would rather have a much stable life. One characteristic of automatic stabilizers is that they take place automatically. They do not require actions of Congress, such as an increase in government spending or a reduction in taxes. Okay. They take place without anybody having to vote for anything. So automatically. So when times are good, somehow they're gonna take away from the good times automatically. When times are bad, they're gonna make the bad times not quite as bad also automatically. So some example of automatic stabilizers would be unemployment compensation. Unemployment insurance compensation. Well, guess what, folks? When do we pay into this unemployment compensation? When do people pay into it? Into it, not from it. Not that they take the money out of it, but they put the money into it. When we have jobs or we don't have jobs?
When we have jobs.
Exactly, when we have jobs. When we are working, that's when you pay into it. You automatically, that money gets set aside. That money that, in other words, when times are good and people have jobs, they take some of that money away from us. If we would have that money, we would spend it and times would be even better. But they take that money away from us. But then when the economy goes into a recession and people start losing their jobs, now that money starts coming back to us, to the people who lost their jobs, and it gives them some money that they wouldn't have if not for this unemployment compensation. So it makes the bad times not quite as bad. So it takes away when times are good and it pays back when times are bad. Another example of an automatic stabilizer that stabilizes the economy is the progressive tax system. Well, how does the progressive tax go? Well, the progressive tax system goes like this. When incomes go higher, they are moving into higher and higher marginal tax rates. And when incomes go lower, they move into lower and lower marginal tax rates. Well, when do income increase? Usually they increase when times are good. And people are getting higher incomes, but they pay more and more in taxes because of those higher incomes. So it takes more money away from them when times are good. When times are bad, and let's say incomes decrease, then what's going to happen? You move into lower and lower marginal tax rate, and you get to keep a little bit more than you would otherwise do. Okay, so that's that. And so if you see a question on the test regarding automatic stabilizers, remember they take place automatically. They do not require any intervention from Congress. Okay. All right, at this point, this is going to be chapter 12, part 2. I can tell you that chapter 13, which I'm going to do next Monday, is going to be very, very easy. It's going to be about as short as this presentation, because it's just going to be an overview what we've done. So I'm going to say, okay, fiscal policy is either expansionary, contractionary, what are the tools, and that's about it. Okay. Then on Tuesday, I'm going to have another lecture, and on Tuesday, I'm going to cover, so Monday, I'm going to cover chapter 13. So today we're done with chapter 12. Monday is going to be chapter 13. And then on Tuesday, I'm going to go back to chapter 11. And I'm going to talk about 2 distinct views of economic policy. One is the Keynesian economic policy, which is a interventionist policy. So they want, if the economy goes bad, they want the government to step in and help. And then there's the classical economic view. And the classical view is that if the economy stumbles, don't worry about it, because the economy will get out of it all by itself. Okay. And government intervention will do nothing but make those ups and downs even higher. So one wants an intervention, one doesn't want intervention. We're going to talk about those 2 schools of economic thought. All righty, folks. So let me stop this.